Hello, and welcome to our next session on public-private collaboration and can it provide a new framework for growth? I have with me today a really fantastic panel from right across the world and of space agencies across the world and indeed the private sector. So I want to thank you all for being with us today. I'd like to introduce Lisa Campbell, President of the Canadian Space Agency. Thank you for being with us, Lisa. Ibrahim Al Kazim, Deputy Director General of the UAE Space Agency. Welcome. And Diswa Mlisa, Acting Chief Executive of South Africa's National Space Agency. Thank you for coming and joining us. And Carlos Moreira, Founder and CEO of WiseKey, that is working on IoT applications of space. So thank you all for joining us. I think this is a really front of mind subject because what's very noticeable to me, having sort of tentatively followed the space sector for about 7 years, is that even 7 years ago, it was very much regarded the preserve of government space was, and we've seen such a dramatic change in all of that. The commercialization of space is well and truly underway. And with NASA and its public procurement, but also its programs, increasingly using the private sector to really push the boundaries of human activity in space. And I think that's what everybody is seeing. So I look forward to our conversation here. I think the first question I'd like to hear from each of you is the different approaches that each of you are taking to the idea of a public-private partnership. And we've seen this rise of the commercial sector. How far do you think, as a space agency, these PPPs should go? Is there any limit to them? I'd like to start first. I'll start with Lisa first.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. As you said, Peggy, space is captivating the world's attention, and we're really entering a new era of space exploration and utilization. The space economy is predicted to grow to 1 trillion by 2040, and our message is that Canada's open for business. We're actively exploring new business models. As you mentioned, Peggy, in the past, it was mainly public space agencies that were involved in space exploration and utilization, although always with strong partnerships with industry. Space is hard. No one can do it alone. And so through our space robotics, our Canadarm1, 2, and now Canadarm3, we've always had strong partnerships with other countries and also with industry. Now that's expanding. As low Earth orbit is increasingly commercialized, we see many space companies developing and helping increase our access to space, so that space as an infrastructure is helping us with some of our key issues here on Earth. Space for climate, space for precision agriculture, helping manage weather events, and more. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm interested. So there are space agencies that have been around for a lot longer, like NASA, than in many countries. And then there are countries that are really moving into becoming spacefaring nations for the first time. And I know that in the UAE, I think you launched your space policy about 5 years ago, if I'm right. Tell me, Abraham, maybe I'm wrong. But you have
Yeah,
already achieved amazing things. You've got the Mars mission, and also a Venus and asteroid belt mission. Talk to me how you see public-private partnerships. You're building from scratch. How do you see the public-private partnership, and how different would that be from the traditional approach?
so again, thank you for the question. I think Lisa said it well. Space is hard. Space is expensive. I think this year marks 25 years since the beginning of the UAE's space program. So we're fairly a young spacefaring nation, or an emerging space nation. What we focused on in the first, I'd say, decade of the beginning of the UAE space program is building capacity across both public and private industry through space exploration mission. It was always a means for the UAE government to diversify its economy. What's interesting about space in the UAE, it was about shifting a culture of that was essentially a culture of traders and building an industrial economy through a space program. I think that was the objective of the Emirates Mars mission. And that continues, as you mentioned, with the asteroid belt mission. The focus on the sequel mission would be more support for the private sector, more opportunities for the private sector. I think one thing that people tend to forget is the amazing achievements of SpaceX and what they've been able to do with reusable launch vehicles would have been impossible without NASA, and they wouldn't continue to grow as a company. So I think the NASA model is one of the best models we've seen in any space program, and I think the PPP would continue to be an essential part of any space program. I think the role of governments and public funding would continue to be to absorb the risk and invest in the science of today and the technology of tomorrow, while the private sector finds an efficient way of scaling up and building the downstream ecosystem.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ibrahim. And in South Africa as well, I know that you're investing the last few years, you're investing a lot to tap into this new market opportunity in South Africa. You've launched the Space Infrastructure Hub to take advantage of ground opportunities and as well as space opportunities. And Diswa, can you please just talk to us a little bit when you're thinking about the relationship between private sector and public and how you work together? Do you look at other nations and have you cherry picked the best and are you doing things differently, or do you think that the public-private partnerships that we are seeing are pretty much the template?
Thank you very much, Peggy. Well, with the South African National Space Agency, we are now celebrating 11 years of the space agency being in business. However, South Africa has got over 50 years of heritage in space, in particular on space operations as well as space weather, and this has been possible because of the international collaborations, as well as our involvement and work with the commercial sector, in particular the international one. When we get to the local industry and the local space, one of the aspects that we look at, and I guess this is also coming because of it being a developing nation, industry development is one of the key aspects of our mandate as a space agency, which then means that we are in a way positioned to make sure that we enter into triple Ps. In looking in terms of how other space agencies have done this, the main one that we come across is through procurement of activities, and particularly so with NASA. And I think one of the aspects of this that we would like to explore is through the unsolicited proposals and unsolicited engagements with the private sector, because traditionally we focus, when we're talking about procurement, we're quite specific on what we're looking for, and if you don't tap into the unsolicited proposals, you then miss out on the opportunities that you could have for partnerships, because you're only looking on one side.
That's very interesting. So almost letting the private sector in a way sort of lead some of the suggest and propose some of the projects to the space agency that you wouldn't have thought about.
Yes.
And one of the big questions that often gets asked is that if I take the example of SpaceX, and Ibrahim, you made the point that SpaceX was funded by NASA, and many people will often say without that first 1.6 billion contract for resupply to the ISS, SpaceX would never really have succeeded. And it does, and a lot of people wonder, that's public money that made SpaceX one of the most highly valued companies on the planet. Do we think the returns for success are fairly shared? Is there an argument that in these PPPs, we need to start building in a little bit more long-term reward for the use of public money, because we can see the commercialization of space? Lisa, do you have a view on that?
That's a great point, Peggy, and I'll just echo what some of my co-panelists said as well. Space agencies have traditionally used procurement, competition, and innovation to stimulate the industrial growth that has allowed us to accomplish everything to date in space. And now we're seeing private sector companies investing of their own accord and helping us increase access to space. expect that governments are going to continue to play a very prominent role in space exploration, both to make sure that the environment remains safe and sustainable for all of the players, whether public or private. Space is congested. There are issues around debris and space traffic management, responsibility for the life cycle of space assets, and we need to make sure that everyone behaves in a way that keeps it safe and peaceful and promotes space exploration. In Canada, we have several programs that are meant to nourish our industrial base and also help them export globally and collaborate with other countries. We have a space technology development program that's invested $200 million and helped develop 300 space-related technologies. And Peggy, to your point, many of those innovations go back into the space sector, but they also benefit many other sectors. As I mentioned at the outset, space is now a key infrastructure for so many government programs: wildfire management, climate management, surveying territory, helping people when there are natural events, even monitoring the health of some wildlife populations as well. In Canada, we also use something called the CubeSat program, in which students and professors can build their own small satellites and get science experiments into space. And we've seen that directly lead to the creation of companies, creating jobs in country. And what's really exciting is we hear from people across Canada, coast to coast to coast, who say that they're able to live and work in their own communities and be part of the global space community, which is very exciting for us.
So it'll be interesting to get, Carlos, your view as a private sector company that does work with governments. You've heard that what Lisa's saying is that the benefit is economic, it's in jobs, it's in new facilities. But do you think there's an argument that a very successful company should pay royalties for the next 20 years or the rest of its life if it wouldn't succeed without that key government procurement contract or funding that got it off the ground? I mean, do you think that's a valid question, or do you think actually the economic benefit is the reward to the state for supporting these startups?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The space revolution is very similar to what happened with the internet revolution. It was founded also by government. The US government founded the internet, and then the web was founded by CERN. And then you had an explosion of innovation that happened around that, and companies and governments started to use that innovation to create different generations of Web 1, 2, and 3. And now we are moving to the space. The model is the same. I think private sector companies, like for instance, WISeKey, we launched 13 picosatellites with a startup in Spain with the name FOSA. This will not be possible if SpaceX will not be providing that service now, because the cost is totally affordable to do that. And we are building our own constellation, which will be totally science fiction 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, right? So I think the benefit is that the cost is going down. The benefit is the innovation is being decentralized. Now you have startups all over the world, then they are investing in the space and they are bringing amazing solutions to the space. The space is very complex. It's not only sending the satellite, it's also the cybersecurity aspects. It is everything related to the IoT. We are connecting 40 billion sensors, how those sensors are going to be connected. And every country should have their own space agency. I mean, you need to decentralize that process. The same way that actually happened also with the internet at the beginning. Remember that the internet was centralized and suddenly the internet became decentralized. So every country needs to be careful about what is going to happen on the space, because if you don't have a presence in the space, somebody will have it for you. So I think the PPP is a great model. I think, as was saying by South Africa, I think this possibility of not necessarily waiting for a tender, because tenders with the current innovation on the fourth industrial revolution, is very hard for space agencies to figure out everything that needs to go into the space. I think to let the private sector to innovate and challenge innovation in each of those countries might be a solution to decentralize that globally.
But again, there is this question: do you think the relationship is fair? I'd be interested to hear from you, Andresa. Do you think that we need a new model for how PPPs reward both the public sector and the private sector?
Peggy, I think there is an element possibly that when we're talking about whether there's a balance in the rewards, whether that's coming from a place of distrust at least from our experience so far. I think I would quite align with what Lisa is saying, in that for a government, when we make these investments as a public sector, we're looking for growth beyond just the financial returns. And when the private companies are able to then create jobs, government benefits, the public as a whole benefits, and when the companies are able to position the countries better because they're opening broader markets, then governments and the public sector as a whole benefits. So I'm not quite. I wouldn't say at this point we would be in a position, especially South Africa, to say yes, let's change the models around the PPPs. And I think also because we haven't explored fully these rewards. What we actually find is that there's still much willingness, even from the space industry itself, and our space industry is very young. However, they're already starting to say they are also in a position where they would like to look at co-investment opportunities with the space agencies, because government has made investments already in some of the space facilities that our industry requires. Now, one of the major challenges that we get as governments is that the manner into which we fund infrastructure projects, and we see space as an infrastructure project, we have a tendency of not looking at the operations and the maintenance of that infrastructure, whether you're talking roads or you're talking dams and so forth. So when we're looking at replacement of our current facilities or upgrades, industry is willing and wants us to look at testing mechanisms where they can actually partner with us on ensuring that we have the funds to do the upgrades, because government has made the initial investment, and in return they get preference in terms of use of access of the facility. So these are some of the models we're looking at, and this is, so I think right now I would more be prone to say we're still at a balance. And in terms of the rewards that comes out of the triple P. And so far, my experience and observations is when we start asking whether the rewards are equal or not, it's more coming from a place of distrust. But at the same time, though, I think where I find public sector is not given due credit is somehow it's very easy to forget that so if you use the example of SpaceX, that initial investment that was made by NASA into the gets forgotten very soon, that actually governments enabled this to happen. And it's the same thing whether you're looking at the GPS capabilities, it gets forgotten very soon that governments actually made those initial investments, and start to be seen as if it's just only private sector that actually made the things happen. So how we keep the visibility and the involvement of government would also actually benefit in the messaging for further investments to be made by the public sector.
That's a hugely important point. And I know that in the space industry, quite often there's a bit of resentment that even though it's super exciting, but a lot of space companies do tend to feel that the public doesn't really understand the scale and range of what space means to us here on Earth. Ibrahim, I'd like to ask you, just in terms of the government's responsibility, a public-private partnership, there are these formal, deals where you'll have a public-private partnership for a particular project, but there's also the government's responsibility in terms of the climate and the atmosphere to ensure those PPPs can work. And do you think there is a government responsibility in terms of sustainability to make these PPPs work through regulation and finance? Are there things there that government should be doing along with working with the private sector on individual projects?
I think absolutely. I think the role of government will continue to be incredibly important. We spoke about how 10 years ago, a lot of what we see commercializable today in space was science fiction, and today we see a major growth in what commercial space is able to provide and to do so feasibly. I think when you look at space today and compare it with what a typical free market economy would look like, it doesn't necessarily overlap entirely. Some of the characteristics of what makes a free market economy would be the private ownership of resources, accessibility to finance and financial institutions, and most importantly, and I think some of the panelists touched upon this, was is freedom to participate. And today, as it stands, I think commercial space doesn't necessarily comply with all three. But it's the role of government to allow for fair and equal access to space. And I think Carlos mentioned it when he said everyone needs to be in space. Every country in the world needs a space agency, because otherwise this is a part of your economy that would be lost to someone else. And this is the future. And I think while this model would be this model, a free market economy, is the best model we know to drive innovation in any economy. It does come with one potential drawback, which is because of efficiency, the focus in these businesses tends to be on profit. And if climate change has taught us anything, is if we want to keep doing what we're doing for a very long time, I think building a sustainable model when exploring and exploiting space is critical, and it's important to do it today before it's too late. And it will continue to be the role of government to enforce that.
So is there absolutely that we don't want to repeat in space what we're doing now. But part of the issue with these public-private partnerships, I feel up until very recently, is that there's been a big focus on pushing us out into space because we can see lots of nations are competing to stake a claim to LEO, to stake a claim to the new space economy. And we're not thinking so much about the environment up there. I just wonder, in these PPPs, sort of in the vacuum in space is regulation. There is no proper regulation for space. And how do we get international agreement on how we regulate what we put up there, how it operates, how we exploit space? Don't governments in these PPPs have a responsibility to start imposing conditions on their partners? Should the PPPs be a means of gradually spreading globally an agreed benchmark and regulation for how we behave and exploit space? Who wants to take that first?
Oh, sorry. I thought that.
Oh.
Go for it. Go ahead.
And Diswa.
Yeah, Peggy, maybe from my point of view, I think we are too early to put more regulations. I think the space at the current situation is very much about an entrepreneurship and leave entrepreneurs the possibility of conquer space. We are at the beginning of the space, and we are, as I mentioned before, we are very similar to where we are on the internet 30 years ago. So if you start to put too much burden on entrepreneurs, they will move somewhere else. I think the important is to define the rules of the game, and they should be universal. They should be not driven by countries, but by international organizations. There are many international organizations out there that could put some kind of process, and leave the liberty to entrepreneurs to raise their money and spirit to bring business applications from space. The moment that we have what we call a kill app on the space, the business model that will make those companies very successful, you will have endless innovation. If you put too much restrictions at the beginning, they will not invest their money. Although I agree that we need to have sustainability in space, but I think it's a different discussion. It's not at the PPP level, it's more at the international level. What are the regulations are?
Okay, that's interesting. So don't regulate us. Let us go on. Lisa, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Peggy. And I just want to pick up on something that the other panelists have said. It was an interesting example that you used, Carlos, of the internet, because some would say that yes, it started with government investment, but some of the vertical and horizontal integration that we saw with the internet didn't always bring back benefits to either individuals or communities. And we're seeing governments step back in now, which is interesting after a couple of decades of operation. And as we think about the evolution of space and those enduring public-private partnerships, which we're nurturing in Canada with programs like the Lunar Exploration Accelerator Program, we're deliberately using government procurement and programs and tax incentives to stimulate growth and competition and choice, while also keeping all of the players involved responsible and accountable for their conduct. As Ibrahim and Andrisa noted, We all have an interest, I would say, not so much in conquering space, but in sharing its incredible benefits together as a global community. We need the perspective of space more than ever, and it's helping us with some of our key challenges here on Earth, as well as, and I do want to talk about this, things like the James Webb Space Telescope, the most powerful space telescope in history, which we're part of with ESA and NASA. Soon, we're going to get data that's going to tell us about the origins of the universe. So as private entities are more present in low Earth orbit and possibly acting on their own with some predictable government regulation that doesn't, to pick up on Carlos's point, it doesn't at all inhibit their growth. In fact, it provides predictable rules of conduct, de-risks the environment for the benefit of everyone, and then actually promotes engagement and, importantly, equity of access to space. We don't want it to be so congested and so difficult to access that it isn't open to everyone for its public benefits. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. We're getting loads of questions from the audience, so it's fantastic. I know it's a bit early, but I'll start scattering some of these questions from the audience through because I think they're really interesting. And one of the first questions is that with the growing role that commercial companies are playing in low Earth orbit and in cislunar services and capabilities, how do space agencies intend to address the challenge of stimulating national industry while also taking advantage of international capabilities, even if they're commercial? I think that's quite an interesting, because we do see a lot of, we all want to encourage our national industries, but space is international, it is global. And Diswa, you were smiling, nodding. Can I ask you to take a stab at that question first?
Thanks, Peggy. It is one of the things that constantly keep us thinking around, because as a developing nation, it becomes a constant challenge in terms of how we bring this balance. But it's actually one of the things we're observing is that the industry itself finds ways of collaborating. So there's one as national space agencies to be collaborating amongst ourselves, but one of the things that we do is to also open up the markets for our industry to collaborate with the international industry. In this way, we actually, the rules of the game in terms of how the international industry comes to play within, take for example our Space Infrastructure Hub project, those rules also get detected by our local industry because of the partnerships that they are formulating all on their own because of the benefits that they are finding. The supply chain when it comes to space is also not so different from the supply chains in the other sectors and other markets. There are things that you find at a national level you'll be very good at, and therefore you position yourself competitively for, and the international players then comes to your local industry for that, whereas your local industry might also go internationally for certain parts of the supply chain aspects of space. So it's quite an interesting space to actually be watching, but constantly, of course, as a national entity, we are guided by ensuring that there's growth in our national industry, and therefore we're always looking more for opportunities on partnerships for increasing that growth rather than replacing that growth with the international roles. At the same time, where we find that there are aspects, if I look, for example, on high resolution data, and we partner with international industries on this because we find that when we're doing our national innovation challenges and the entrepreneurs are looking for providing solutions and tapping into solutions that are provided by very high resolution data, we do not have a market currently in the country that actually provides that then calls for us to partner with the international companies in provision of that, both for human capital development, but as well as providing operational services to our local government. So you go where the need lies, and you increase the partnerships where it's possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Andisa. Ibrahim, in building up, you also talked about wanting to build up the national industry. I mean, when you do international collaboration, which I know you do, in particular with the United States, I mean, do you put certain kind of sourcing conditions on them? Is this again part of, if you're doing PPEs, are there certain sourcing conditions linked to them? Do you ask for transfer technology? How do you balance this need to internationally collaborate with the need to build the local industry?
So I think it was said very well earlier in terms of industry finds a way to collaborate with industry, and I think for the UAE, I think you mentioned that we have our strongest collaboration in space has been with South Korea, the U.S. and France. And with the U.S., we decided to build our Mars exploration mission. It was built on the global efforts to explore Mars, and it was meant to complement a larger global vision. And I think that was also a driver for why the UAE was one of the first signatories for the Artemis Accord. I think it's important that governments don't let this private space revolution turn into a second space race, but fought through the private enterprises, but build a global narrative to where we want to arrive at as a species, and that in its turn would create opportunities for industries, whether it's through building the first colony on the surface of the moon or Mars, and just creating opportunities for globally, but for local industries. Everyone does different. Everyone is good at different things within that ecosystem, and everyone will find a part within that global vision.
Thank you. Well, Carlos, as a private company, do you find that there is a sort of nationalism in these big projects that are being sponsored by space agencies and governments that makes it more difficult for you to get in, or how do you view that balance?
Yeah, it is absolutely the case that space is to become, again, monopolized. It's like telcos, right? A lot of the functions of a space are going to replace telecommunications on Earth, and it's going to be a fight who conquer and who controls that. So they are the superpowers on the internet, and see the people that they are investing in space are people that they have been very successful on internet companies. They are putting the same energy and the same structure to basically try to exclude everybody else. But I think the opportunities are endless. I think space solves problems that the humanity needs to solve in priority. I mean, 20% of the land is not yet connected in Africa. 90% of the sea is not connected. We need to connect everything. We are connecting objects to the satellite, which is the cheapest way to connect. And this is going to compete and put pressure on telcos because they will have to reduce their price. So it's going to be a fight between the monopolies and they control communications, they control the internet now, with new companies that they are emerging, and they are becoming basically the challenger. The good news is that the technology behind the space is open to anyone. You don't need to you don't need to depend on a multinational to develop for you a pico satellite. You can do it yourself. You can put your own microchips to secure the communication. You can encrypt the line. So there's going to be I would say companies that they are solving concrete problems, then they're going to expand very fast and become truly representative. Back again to my point that every country needs to have their own space agency or Ministry of Space in the future, because you need to develop a strategy. A PPP is not enough. I mean, behind the success in the America, SpaceX, NASA cooperation, there wasn't a strategy. That strategy was very well thought at the beginning, and obviously that strategy was crystallized by the fact that you have an entrepreneur that created the right environment to that to happen. That needs to happen everywhere in the world. I mean, every country should have their own entrepreneurs, their own startups, they should be looking carefully about those startups, because some of them, they are growing very fast. I am from Switzerland. We have a very interesting ecosystem now around space, not only from the satellite, but communication, encryption, microchips, and everything. So this is something that is going to decentralize the control on the space, and I fully agree with what was said before. We'll repair some of the mistakes we made on the internet era, right, where only few companies and very few individuals grasp the benefit. I think we have a good opportunity to do this in a more decentralized peer-to-peer model, using new technologies that allow you to basically have every country will have their own access to the space in an uncompromisable way.
Thank you. The next question we have, I'm gonna throw this one to you, Lisa. It's an interesting model for a public-private partnership, I guess. It's the UK's decision to invest directly into OneWeb. And the question is, should this be seen as a way for countries to provide funding, but in a way so as to maximize the potential return on investment and build local industrial capacity? Or is the direct investment risk too high for most governments? And I would add an addendum to that in terms of, should the government be thinking subsidies, or should it be thinking about funding it differently? And within that, the OneWeb model, what do you think of it?
Thanks very much, Peggy. I think we're in a period of wonderful experimentation. As Andrisa said, government is not the sole holder of good ideas. And many of these ideas, solutions to issues we didn't know we had, can come from industry, and we welcome that. Historically in space, government has used a mix of grants, of procurement, of competition to stimulate the innovation that we need in space. So historically, we've used a mix of competition, procurement to stimulate innovation. And now, as the cost is decreasing to access space, and as Carlos mentioned, more and more entrants are coming into space. Thank you very much, colleagues. We're seeing that there are more players, which is wonderful, so they can help offer choice and value as we enter into space. And I think all of us need to be open to those new arrangements, making sure that we incentivize business conduct. So who owns the intellectual property? What industrial benefits? What open science will flow from it? So that we're continuing to stimulate innovation. I'll harken back to what Ibrahim said. Space is among the most challenging things that we do, and no one can do it alone. You need industrial partners. You often need international partners. So many countries, like Canada, we've been involved in space for many decades, but we'll focus on specific areas of industrial strength and then welcome the world, Canada, partner with us, and also export our capabilities worldwide. So we're focused on space for climate, because we have a vast country with all sorts of different geographic regions, and we've got unique capabilities in synthetic aperture radar with our RadarSat constellation mission, and we help Canada and the world with those capabilities. We're focused on space robotics because of our historic expertise with Canadarm1, 2, and now Canadarm3 for the Lunar Gateway, an AI-enabled arm which will help construct that space station orbiting the moon. We're very excited about that, and having a Canadian astronaut fly around the far side of the moon. And then also space, deep space food and deep space health. We haven't talked about that yet, but as we move further into deep space and humans explore further into deep space, we're going to need to sustain them and sustain their health and their well-being. Developing all of those technologies helps us with issues here on Earth. The pandemic has highlighted health inequities across the globe. We're also increasingly facing food security issues. And as we develop those technologies for deep space, it will help us with issues here on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to come to Ibrahim as well and ask you, do you think there's a role for equity stakes in some of these, the government to hold equity stakes the way the UK does in OneWeb, or should the funding be done entirely differently?
I don't think there is one right way of doing it. I think different models would work for different countries depending on what level of maturity the space program has reached, and then the size of its industrial complex. So I think this might actually work for the UK government, and it depends on how rapid you want this local industrial capacity to be built in. I think OneWeb is a very strategic investment by the UK government, given that the window for mega constellations will soon start to close. So no, I think there are many different ways of doing it, and there's no one right way of doing it.
You raise a very important point about the window for mega constellations. I'm afraid I'm not up to speed on where Africa is on this, Andiswa, but what is South Africa's particular view about having a Leo constellation? Is that something that South Africa feels the need to have, or can quite happily contract in?
Thank you so much, Peggy. We absolutely have an interest in this, and in particular, not just for South Africa, but looking in as an African continent. So there's a number of constellations that, in partnership with the other African countries, your Nigeria, Kenya, and Algeria, and others, where we're looking at a resource management constellation. And Ibrahim is quite correct. The window around these constellations is closing rapidly because of some of the issues that have been raised earlier on, even by the NASA administrator in his opening remarks. However, there's also still a need on the ground, because the need for data and information is forever increasing. So on one side, whether the space has the capability to actually contain and hold all these constellations, and versus the need that we're actually forever seeing, whether you're talking climate change or you're talking food security or urban expansion, as is some of the challenges that within the continent we're still faced with, is finding this balance. But there's definitely an interest in going that far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take we've got about 3 more minutes. I'll take another question from the audience. And the question here is, so far we've seen public-private partnerships in the space sector largely in satellite, spaceship launch, satellite manufacturing, launch, or vehicle manufacturing companies. But the investment forecasts are already betting quite big exponential growth in second-order space industry. I mean, the applications for which the data is used. Do you think we're going to see a shift in the types of public-private partnerships that have been largely about infrastructure or platforms? Or do you think that's where the PPEs should stay, and that the rest goes down to the private sector? Carlos, I'll come to you first. What do you think?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I personally believe the private sector should be the one driving this. I think the PPP demand gets formalized once you have an innovation breakthrough. For instance, now a big subject on picosatellite is sending data directly to clouds and being able with AI to analyze data from cloud. So now you have a very big cloud providers, and they are suddenly very interested in the space, because it's a much cheaper way to do that than if they do that from centralized hubs, or blockchain companies, and they are putting blockchain's node in the space. We're working with some blockchain companies, and they are now reversing the logic. Rather than putting the node on Earth, they are putting the node on Earth. So this kind of innovation goes too fast to formalize that on a PPP. I think there is, and from my experience, I used to work in the UN for many years. From my experience on PPP, the process is very slow. I don't know if this has changed, but countries are processing PPP in a very bureaucratic and administrative way, which does not at all follow the dynamics of the private sector in this particular area, which is space.
Interesting. And Lisa, PPP's too slow. There's another, phase of investment and development in space. Do you agree with Carlos? Do you think that bit should be left to the private sector because space agencies and governments are too slow?
Yeah, just wanted to confirm, were you asking me or Andrisa?
Yes, Lisa, I'm asking you. Yes, sorry.
Thank you so much. I think it's tremendous to see that there are so many more companies becoming involved in space. For example, in Canada, we've got a film company called Félix and Paul, who are the first to put a 3D camera on the International Space Station. And they've created an immersive experience where you put on a virtual reality headset and you feel like you're doing an extravehicular walk on the space station. And that's wonderful because it increases access to space. So to the extent that governments can nourish a broad ecosystem flowing from the benefits of those original investments, that's wonderful. But I agree with Carlos that industry also does a wonderful job of selecting those which are worth investing in, which are viable business models. But we know a lot of this flows from open access, from access to some science, to some data, to images. So we're very heavily invested in incentivizing business conduct so that the private sector can invest, but that there's also follow-on benefits, many of which we may not even be able to imagine yet.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And I hate to say it because I found this session just so interesting, but we've run out of time, guys. I'm really sorry. I really hope that I get to meet you in person so that I can carry on this conversation, because I think there's just loads of things we haven't touched on, and that's my fault. So apologies, but thank you. And to our audience, I just want to say that our next the next session will be Franz Fayo, the Minister of Economy and Minister for Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs from Luxembourg. As you may know, Luxembourg was very proactive in the whole idea of space resource exploitation and management. But unfortunately, the minister couldn't be with us live because he had a last-minute clash. But we did send him some questions, and he has filmed a short response. So we'll be watching that. And then after Minister Fayo, the summit will hand you over to my colleague Richard Waters in San Francisco, who's going to give us a fascinating panel on the US space economy. So again, thank you so much to my panelists, and thank you to the audience for those great questions, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Pleasure.